I really like it here, and it's fun, and I really don't want to go to sleep because it's so fun here, and there's so much to do.
The great utopia, the better life, helping each other as one big, happy family. It was something that was absolutely amazing.
But when Dad got there, it was a very different environment.
I'm principled and dedicated to my people.
He was tricking people, but did people see it?
They trusted him and they believed him, but he was a crazy son of a... and he was willing to see them all die.
I believe that madness can happen to anyone, under the right circumstances.
The mass murderer. And you asked me before what I felt about Jim Jones. I think he's a monster.
Jim Jones became a maniac. There's no doubt about it.
You said he's crazy.
No.
Do you think he was always crazy?
No, I don't. I don't think he was always like that.
He came with news of salvation, promises of joy and happiness. But what his followers never realized was that Jim Jones was never taking them to paradise. He was a deranged man who would lead nearly 1,000 people to their deaths in just a single day. The story started all the way back in 1931 when a strange boy, Jim, was born to his mom Lynetta and his father James Jones. This was a time of great turmoil in America after it was hit by the Great Depression.
For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes.
Due to this, Jim's family had to move around the country a lot just to survive before eventually settling in Lynn, Indiana. Jim would start going to school there, and pretty quickly, the kids in the school started looking at him as the weird kid. They would probably be justified in thinking that since Jim exhibited very odd behaviors like stabbing a cat and holding long and elaborate funerals for his pets. Jim grew up going to church with his parents but not having many friends. As he grew up and got into his teenage years, he became focused on his schoolwork and even graduated with honors from his high school. However, during his time in school, Jim became extremely interested in the works of Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler, leading him to develop a confrontational attitude and to become strong in his opinions. It's now the 1950s, and a 20-year-old Jim saw just how quickly his country has changed. He grew up during the Great Depression and the Second World War. This meant that a life of poverty and struggle would shape who he is as a person and mold him into the person he would soon become. In the 50s, America saw a sudden and great economic boom, creating vast amounts of wealth for its citizens, leading them to become a largely consumerist population, completely forgetting the value of hard work and filling their lives with buying things. This rubbed Jim the wrong way because of his views on people having too much wealth. To Jim, this was too much, and living in this consumerist way would lead people down the wrong path. Jim thought the best way to live life was to only have the things one needed and to be a part of a strong community led by a communist government, instead of what he saw in his country, which was people becoming increasingly individualistic and living a life of excess. Jim joined the local Communist Party and tried to teach the population about this, but that was a time when America was largely an anti-communist country, so much so that there were threats of imprisonment and even violence towards anyone labeled as a communist. This led Jim to become more alienated from the public and decided to give his teachings through another means. Despite his communist views, Jim was actually a junior pastor at a local Methodist church. He became quite the figure because people were drawn in by his charisma and how he spoke in public, but he would soon leave the church after they refused to allow mixed-race congregations. In 1956, he scrounged up some money to buy his own church building and formed his church, the Wings of Deliverance, which would later be named People's Temple Full Gospel Church. He intertwined his extremist and communist views into his religious teachings, leading people to accept his views as religious truth. Another selling point is that Jim's church allowed all types of people to attend, regardless of their race.
Watching the children's choir, which is also perfectly, beautifully integrated, singing songs. I remember there was just so much color. You saw every color of the rainbows. They seated people black, white, black, white. He would, out of nowhere, jump off the stage wrap an African-American woman up in his arms and just love her up and kiss her, and my heart would melt.
He seemed like a kind and charismatic leader, and that led him to gather over 3,000 followers. In the 1970s, he moved his church to San Francisco, deeming Indiana to be too conservative for his views. Jim became huge in California, amassing support from all sorts of public figures because of his work to bring people together. Celebrities and politicians like Herb Kahn, Governor Jerry Brown, and even Vice President Walter Mondale. But things would soon turn sour. Despite Jim amassing even more followers, Jim was starting to not be as trusted by the local people. Stories started coming out about his teaching, and people started to become suspicious of his communist-leaning views. Even former members were starting to come out with stories about his forceful nature when behind closed doors, and that he would even force his followers to sell their belongings like their cars and houses just to donate the money to the church. The community started growing in closeness as Jim became more and more hated by the public.
There's someone trying to assassinate Jim Jones.
This wouldn't work for Jim, as he wanted to live and preach in a community that would appreciate him, so he decided to move again. This time, leaving America altogether to move all the way down to Guyana, and his followers came with him to live in this socialist paradise that Jim promised them.
I've never been so totally happy or fulfilled in my life. I can't begin to describe it. You could sit here and talk all day long and no words could describe the peace, the beauty, the sense of accomplishment and responsibility and camaraderie that's here.
They would name their new settlement the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but the public would come to know it as Jonestown. At first, things were all sunshine and rainbows in Jonestown. People were all content and happy to live there, blissfully unaware that Jim had secretly restricted their passports and barred them from returning to their old lives. Everyone relied on Jim for everything like news about the outside world, and even basic daily needs. But this is where his followers start to get glimpses into the underlying deranged mindset when he went on one of his famous endless speeches, where he would consider himself as a reincarnation of Lenin, Jesus, or another historical figure that aligned with his values. Life at Jonestown started to get hard, with Jim forcing his followers to work 12-hour shifts at the farms, 6 days out of the week. Armed guards would patrol the compound, and anyone who was caught trying to escape would be injected with lots of depressants to keep them in the community. The American embassy took these allegations and wanted to investigate, but when interviewing the members of Jonestown, all they could find is that these people actually enjoyed living there. But Jim started to hear about members wanting to leave, and he would encourage his followers to turn in anyone that they suspected might have thoughts of leaving the community.
It's blasphemy. It's blasphemy to talk about going back when you have not been given any approval. Do you want to go home? Oh. Well, then be seated and shut your mouth and don't be in my face anymore.
When concern was raised by the relatives of the church members from back home, a congressman, Leo Ryan, decided to take a trip down to Jonestown with reporters and cameras to see what was going on there. He arrived there and things seemed to be running smoothly, and the people really loved staying there. But soon it would be discovered that all of the smiles were fake. A nervous member would pass a note to one of the reporters asking the senator for help to leave Jonestown. The senator would confront Jim about the note, and Jim would later allow anyone who wanted to leave to go back with the senator. When the planes arrived, Jim would send his loyal follower Larry Layton with the group, pretending to be part of the defectors. But as soon as they boarded the plane, Larry would start shooting at the people and would injure 2 people before he was stopped. On the runway, the senator and his entourage would wait till the last minute to get as many people as they could to go back home with them. But they would soon spot a tractor pulling up to their plane. At first, they didn't pay it much attention, but the people inside would step out with guns and start shooting at the planes, and they would end up killing 6 people, including the senator, and injuring many others, forcing the pilots to leave the injured at the runway and taking off back to the Capitol. Jim would gather his people into the pavilion, their main congregation area, to give one last speech that he chose to record.
You can't take off with people's children without expecting a violent reaction, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. 1,200 people's lives in my hands, and I certainly don't want your life in my hand. But I'm going to tell you, Christine, without me, life has no meaning. I'm the best friend you'll ever have.
He would later give each of them a flavored drink. It tasted like Kool-Aid, but he's added something else to it. A mixture that would poison every member and guide them to their death. Everyone, from the little children to the oldest member of the congregation, would take their poison happily, still believing that they were being saved by Jim.
I'd rather see them lay like that than to see them have to die like the Jews did. Death is, I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear, I don't care how many anguished cries. Death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life.
Although he is framing it as giving them a choice, Jim would surround the pavilion with armed guards to make sure no one would escape. He would stay in there and confuse and convince his followers to follow him down to death, despite them trying to argue with him.
I said I'm afraid to die.
I don't think you are. I don't think you are.
But I look at our babies and I think they deserve to live.
I agree.
You know?
But also they deserve, what's more, they deserve peace.
We all came here for peace.
And have we had it?
No.
I tried to give it to you. I've laid down my life practically. I've practically died every day to give you peace, and you've still not had any peace. You look better than I've seen you in a long while, but it's still not the kind of peace that I wanted to give you.
When the Guyanese military arrived the next day, they saw all those people spawned on the field, dead along with Jim, who was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. They managed to rescue a few that were still alive and took them to a hospital to recover. They found notes and wills written by people expressing their wish to die as part of the community. In total, 909 people were found dead at the pavilion, a third of them being children. The bodies were collected and transported back to America by the Air Force and would be identified before they were laid to rest. The grueling process would end up scarring the workers who were tasked with fingerprinting the bodies. After a year, more than 300 bodies were claimed by their family members, but more than 500 were still left unclaimed, leaving the government to put them in a mass grave after searching for a cemetery that agreed to process their burial, ending the decades-long saga of the People's Temple Full Gospel Church and of Jim Jones.